Welcome, everyone. Happy Earth Day. We really appreciate your taking the time out of your day to be with us discussing climate change and action during adolescence. I'm Andrew Fellini. I'm one of the co-executive directors of the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent. Our mission at the center is to promote the integration of developmental science into policies, practice, and public discourse in order to advance a shared commitment to creating the conditions that support young people. Here at CDA, we do this in a variety of ways, including organizing and participating in conversations about how we can best leverage the science of adolescence to recognize the opportunity of adolescence and how we can best meet the developmental needs of young people. Climate change affects us all, but the effects of climate change and climate change-related disasters have unique impact upon adolescents who are disproportionately affected by both the physical and the mental health impacts of climate change. Here in Los Angeles, we recently witnessed some devastating fires that displaced thousands of people and left many people without their homes. It created devastation across the city in different areas, and it also impacted the mental health of those who witnessed the disaster, which was made worse by climate change, as well as the ongoing challenges of responding to the devastation that occurred as a result of those fires. But also in response to this devastation, LA also saw many young people mobilize around the city to help their communities and to advocate for climate justice. The city saw young people come out en masse to support their communities by creating huge social media crowdfunding campaigns, by volunteering their time and their money to help the victims of the fire, and even establishing mental health and physical support networks like Altadena Girls, which was organized by 14-year-old Avery Colvert, who became the youngest recipient of the Time 100 Impact Award because of her actions. Taking action against climate change can promote positive development by providing opportunities to fulfill key developmental needs, like finding meaning and purpose through contribution, and finding a respected role among peers, adults in the larger community. Research even suggests that taking action can promote positive feelings and buffer the mental health impacts of climate change. And this is what we are discussing today. How can we best support adolescents who are impacted by climate change, and why we should encourage climate action among young people? We're very thrilled to have joining us in the conversation today 3 leaders who are working in this area in a variety of different kinds of ways. We have Larissa Dooley, who is the Director of Research and Programs at the Climate Mental Health Network. We have Sander Tomas, the Vice Dean of Research and Impact, and also the Professor of Developmental Psychology and Professor of Green Teens, all at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And then finally, we have Merlot Godushi, an undergraduate majoring in psychology and anthropology, who is also a member of the Center's Youth Scientific Council in Adolescence, who as a group participate in our translation and dissemination activities. All right, let's start with Larissa. Larissa, from what you know about the research, how does climate change impact young people?
Well, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that climate change is having some negative impacts on mental health and well-being of adolescents. And this happens through both direct and indirect pathways. So youth who have been directly affected by a climate change related disaster, a wildfire like the ones we had here in January, as well as floods and major hurricanes, extreme heat, we often see increases in mental health symptoms in adolescents following major climate disasters. There's a solid body of research showing that we see increases in post-traumatic stress symptoms and symptoms of anxiety and depression, substance use, decreases in school performance, and other issues in young people following disasters like that. As for the indirect impacts of climate change on youth mental health, even young people who haven't been directly impacted by a climate disaster can still experience real psychological anguish about climate change. This is often what is referred to as eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. It refers to the thoughts and emotions and accompanying physical sensations like increased heart rate and tightening in the throat that arise just to being aware of the reality of climate change and its impacts. and the losses that it's causing for people around the globe and here in the US, and the threats to the future that it is posing. So this can be triggered, these kind of indirect impacts can be triggered by reading about climate change, watching disasters play out on the news, scrolling on social media. So all of these things can cause kind of these indirect impacts of climate change on mental health or climate anxiety. And to give you an idea of the prevalence of that among adolescents in the US, there was a major study that was released last year from Eric Lewandowski and his colleagues. It was a large study of nearly 16,000 young people, ages 16 to 25, from all 50 states and DC. And it was, they took care to include young people from all different kind of socio-political contexts. And they found that overall, 85% of young people said they were worried about climate change, with 58% very or extremely worried. And 43% of young people in the study said that climate change negatively impacts their mental health. And 38% said that their feelings about climate change negatively impacts their daily life or their ability to function. And we know that it's really shaping major life decisions for young people, their choices whether or not to go to college or what career to pursue, whether to have kids. So it's really kind of impacting them in these profound ways. But I did say there was good news, and the good news you touched on a little bit, Andrew, which is that we also see that climate change is creating some real unique opportunities for young people to build emotional resilience, to connect with their community out in the real world, to kind of come together with other people in their communities and make changes and start to take action, and to come up with imaginative solutions. And we saw a lot of that after the LA wildfires here in January. And I think we're going to hear more about that from some of the other panelists.
Those numbers are just striking. And whenever I see numbers like that, it's just startling. I do think it's for folks of older generations, when they see those, I think just they need to see this a few times to realize the significance of this issue for young people. I do think those of us of older generations recognize that climate change is a significant issue, but the extent to which it's very present and going to be present throughout the lives of young people, I think is a harder time for us to fully appreciate until we see numbers like this. This is, I should also say for the audience, this is not the only study that has shown this. It doesn't show up just in the United States, it shows up around the world. I'm sure Sander will be talking about that as well, particularly in regions that are more significantly affected by climate change. So we'll be talking about the impact, and we'll also be talking about what young people can do and are doing in response to that. So thank you. Let's move over to Merlot to get some comments from Merlot. Merlot, growing up in Los Angeles, how have you experienced climate change, and how do you think it has impacted you?
Growing up in Los Angeles and learning about climate change has both its ups and downs. It's a very populated city, with lots of traffic, as many of us know, which leads to a lot of pollution as a result. There are also many animals who are dying because we are unable to keep them safe, just like the whales in Huntington Beach and Long Beach just this week. Looking back, the first time I remember learning about climate change was in 7th grade with my teacher, Mr. Nettemeyer, who was a social justice leader and taught us about current events within climate change and about Greta Thunberg. I also continue to learn about climate change each week in my anthropology courses with Professor Grebler, which I'm very grateful to continue my education on climate change. We just had a project in our linguistic anthropology class where we all brought food from a different culture, and using biodegradable plates and cutlery was really important because we were trying to limit waste, and I thought that was pretty interesting, as well as looking at the ecosystems on campus. We got to tour and see that, which I really appreciated. This was the first time that I was able to really see what campus life is with ecosystems like that, which was super fascinating to me. And also after graduating Palisades Charter High School last year, which was heavily impacted by the fires, I saw how much it impacted the mental health of many current students, but also alumni, because it was a second home for all of us. And many people in the Los Angeles area, especially people my age, they have taken the opportunity to create change, but also it's honestly very devastating. Many people lost their homes and it's impacted our mental health quite a bit, which I think right now it's important and crucial that we continue to support each other to the best of our abilities. Even if we don't know how, we can research and ask others, our teachers, our professors, people on the council, and anybody I'm sure here would be able to also help you understand how to help both the ecosystem, but also those who are impacted by the fire.
Thank you for sharing the experiences of yourself and your friends and your community as a result of the fires in the Palisades area. As we were noting at the beginning of when we were preparing for this discussion today, it was only this week that the students at the high school that was heavily affected by the fires have been able to get back together in an abandoned department store building, and actually the elementary schools in that area, 2 of them were burned down and they've been completely displaced onto other schools. And that is only one part of the LA region that has been affected. The Altadena area is another area that was severely and heavily affected. But clearly Los Angeles is not the only place. These are issues that are playing out around the world in a variety of different kinds of ways, as is the energizing of young people to sort of do something and respond to this really is one of the major issues of their generation, of their time. So we're going to move on to Sander and talk about this part of it a little bit. Sander, you were the PI of the research project Green Teens, in which aims to understand and promote eco-friendly behavior during adolescence. Can you talk a little bit about this project? And can you talk about some of your key findings?
Yes, thank you, Andrew, and also many thanks for the invite, of course. Yeah, so Green Teens, the Green Teens project is a longer-term research project funded by the European Research Council, and yeah, so we aim to understand the psychological factors, the drivers of eco-friendly behavior in adolescence, and also we explore ways to promote such behavior. And I do want to emphasize that, of course, young people are not responsible for climate change, nor can they be held accountable for coming up with solutions to climate change. At the same time, we also know from research that many young people, especially adolescents, are actually highly motivated to do what they can within their own possibilities to act on climate change. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. First, young people are disproportionately impacted or will be disproportionately impacted by climate change throughout their lifetimes. This is also the first generation that is coming of age in a world that is threatened by climate change. And the second reason is that we know, Andrew, from your and your group's work, that many adolescents experience a need to contribute positively to the world around them, and to redress society's fault lines, if you will. And acting on climate change is one way to do that. And so we have developed a theory based on recent insights into how to understand and promote adolescent behavior change, on how we can understand and promote adolescents' eco-friendly behavior change. And so what we argue, what the theory argues, is that young people will often refrain from engaging in eco-friendly behavior if they do not really see how that behavior is relevant to what they deeply care about in their everyday lives. For example, their need for autonomy or their need to be respected by peers, right? And in that scenario, eco-friendly behavior becomes much like a chore, so behavior that you know is important but is not really appealing in and of itself. But also the theory argues that this can be switched around and that many young people will be very motivated to act in eco-friendly ways if they do see how that behavior is relevant to their here and now needs and wants. So, for example, when they view eco-friendly behavior as behavior for independent-minded people who are mature enough to have a say, or who are mature enough to help redress society's fault lines. And so just very briefly, one example of a study that we did was conducted by Jenna Spitzer, PhD candidate. So she was interested in using this theory that I just talked about to translate that theory in climate education for high school students here in the Netherlands and also in China. And it was an experiment, and she randomly assigned participants in that experiment, so second or high school students, to one of two conditions. And in one condition, participants just received, say, traditional climate education that focused on or that explained the causes and consequences of climate change and what you can do about it. And then in the intervention condition, she provided similar information, but this time she also emphasized that young people are increasingly taking matters into their own hands. And together they are increasingly acting on climate change. And she also said that, or she showed research showing that climate change or acting on climate change is respected by peers. And then we provided participants with a snack coupon, and we said, "Oh, later this afternoon we will have a food stand outside in the schoolyard, and you can exchange this snack coupon for potato chips." And at the food stand, we offered participants a choice between chips from a well-known brand that was not so sustainably produced, or chips from an unknown brand that was sustainably produced. And we registered what choices they made. And then in the intervention condition, she found that participants were more likely to choose for the sustainably produced chips. So this was an effect for the same day, but then 4 weeks later, this effect was still there. And we also replicated this effect in China. So just to illustrate how we try to bring that theory into the classroom.
Sandra, thanks for sharing that. There's so much science behind that. I wish we had a couple of hours to get into it deeply, but I'm going to try to highlight a couple of things. And Larissa, I'm going to signal you. I'm going to ask you to make a comment on this, given what I know your expertise to be. So in a lot of ways, what you're doing is sort of highlighting the fact that presenting information to people in order to create change is rarely enough. And this is who we are as human beings. And it's also true for young people as it is for adults. So if we give information about how to make healthy choices or how to improve the environment or how to do X, Y, or Z, that's often not enough. We need to sort of create a motivation behind it and how it's tied into what other kinds of goals that we're trying to achieve. The second thing is that it seems to be is what you're really tapping into are these really incredibly unique opportunities of the adolescent period. One of them is that very much we want to belong and we want to contribute to our social groups. We all do throughout our lifespan, but particularly during the years of adolescence. And frankly, we're designed to do that because we're trying to figure out where we belong, where we fit in, how we can contribute, what's our role going to be in the larger community. So this desire to connect, to contribute, really seems to be some really fundamental developmental needs and opportunities of young people that you're really tapping into. We can also talk about the brain science behind that. This is really, you're also tapping into sort of the heightened motivational regions that we see during the adolescent years, how it's connecting to regulatory regions, how it's connecting to regions that have to do with how we think about the social world and how they increasingly over time really operate together for us to engage in complex tasks. But for these things to happen, we need to scaffold the opportunities for young people, right? So you're not just giving information, but you're also not totally telling young people what to do. You're setting up a situation for them to create change themselves. Did I fairly represent that, Sander? Is there anything I missed about some of the science behind that?
I couldn't explain this better myself. Yeah.
So Larissa, before we go on to Merlot, I did want to ask you, I know that you have a lot of expertise in health behavior and learning about promoting mental and physical health and so on. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that sort of question of it's not enough just to give someone a curriculum, but actually we need to provide experiential learning opportunities and also provide motivational reasons for people to sort of engage in these kinds of behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that theory really interesting and useful, Xander. And it really aligns with, I'm going to talk about a curriculum we developed a little bit later in this talk, but or in this conversation, but what we heard from teachers, we were developing a curriculum for them to use in their classrooms with their adolescents, middle school students. And they said, like, you know, when you're developing this curriculum, try to include stuff that's a lot of peer-to-peer messaging. Like, don't, you know, the kids, they don't want to hear what to do from adults. They want to hear it from their peers. So it makes sense. Now I can say that that's due to motivation alignment theory. Yeah, but I think that, you know, for a long time that climate change messaging was operating on this information deficit model, right? So that we thought that what was missing was that people just really need to know more information about climate change in order to take action. And we did that for a long time in the climate change world. A lot of people, you know, gave a lot of information about all the bad things that were going to happen. And it really didn't work. A lot of people, you know, it caused people to kind of become overwhelmed a lot of times, and to kind of turn away from the issue because they were overwhelmed and didn't know how to cope with the magnitude of the problem. And so increasingly what we try to think about is really the role of emotions, as, you know, because we know that emotions are primary drivers of behavior, and that when we're talking to you know, young people and adults alike about climate change, that we really have to pay attention to kind of a role of emotions. And it's just one of the drivers of behavior, right? There's other things going on as well, but emotions being, you know, what emotions am I eliciting in young people when I'm talking to them about climate change? Am I overwhelming them with anxiety, or am I trying to balance, you know, the hard, honest truths about climate change with also positive information and ways that they can get in on the action that, you know, and create this kind of, you know, it's a fine balance, but to strike that balance so that you can get people, you know, to motivate them to take action rather than to kind of get into fight or flight mode, or freeze mode, and kind of either get, you know, overwhelmed and anxious, or just kind of as a coping mechanism turn off, change the channel. So.
Thanks, Larissa. Now, Merlot, when you were in the beginning, when you introduced your self and talked about how you first got into this issue, it was very experiential. You did, notably, you didn't say, "Hey, I read a worksheet on climate change." You actually talked about experiences that you had, and you got out there, and your teachers are giving opportunities to learn to do something about it. And since then, you've been very involved in climate action related projects. Can you talk a little bit about those projects and how they shaped you and your community?
Wow, Sandra, this was really fascinating, and I would love to get involved with Green Teens. And Larissa, I also agree that peer-to-peer learning is quite important and impactful. To build off what you asked, I think I've been very involved in climate action related projects, as well as mental health related projects. For example, since I was in second grade, I've been attending Heal the Bay events and doing beach cleanups as much as possible. And I also had a fundraiser in sixth grade for Hurricane Katrina and created pamphlets giving important information on how to support, which, yes, the funds were important to help recover from the hurricane, but I also feel like getting that information and making it digestible for adolescents was extremely important because it could be talked about, but they may not understand exactly what the impact has been. So that was really important for me to do. Additionally, like after watching the film Period End of Sentence, which I definitely recommend you all watch, it's super interesting. I was recognized as top 10 in the world with the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, and I created a platform called We Grow Stronger Together to provide feminine care products to women living in underprivileged countries and finding ways to make these pads biodegradable and not to hurt the planet as a result. When I watched the film, there's a part in the film where there's a bunch of pads that are basically like a mountain and they're just put to the side. And honestly, that's hurting the planet. And it's just sitting there, it's hurting people. It's just it was very sad to see. So once I saw that, I said, I need to make a change. And that's something that I feel like if we get more ability to show other adolescents these films about climate change, it will inspire them to get involved, just how I did. And from these projects, something that's really important is I gained a sense of identity and purpose and what I wanted to do with my life and did not want to do with my life, which is creating change and supporting others and not being a bystander. I think it's super important to take action today, not tomorrow, which is something that I try to live by. Because even if you say I'll do it tomorrow, it could be postponed even later. But if we take action right now, we can prevent things from getting more difficult to unravel. So yeah.
Wow, Merlot, that's really an incredible amount of work that you've been doing already in your life. I'm curious, you have the ideas, you were stimulated by some things that happened in the world, or you, Greta Thunberg, or your teacher who inspired you, and then you wanted to do something. How did you go from that, hey, maybe I want to do something, to actually doing it? Were there people involved? Were there opportunities or resources there? What got you to that next step?
Yeah, so something I like a lot of people tell me is I have a lot of ideas and there's just so much going on that sometimes I just need to like sit down, create a bubble map and decide, okay, this is the issue that I want to focus on right now at this moment. And creating like a step-by-step action plan where you kind of just create bullet points, but also ask people in your community, even if it's your professor, about how you can make an impact. But I also read a lot of articles and watched films, which I feel like really helped me to create an idea and then take that into action.
Thanks for sharing. And so you clearly you had access to information and materials, and you also went out there to talk to people who then were very willing and supportive to share you things. I'm sure you had some people who maybe didn't necessarily respond, but then you did have people who I'm sure who were responsive. And I think that that's an important theme to highlight here, that when our young people want to do something, particularly about climate change or thinking about it, rather than dismissing it or shortening the conversation, opening the conversation and seeing that as an opportunity to support them with what they want to do. So Larissa, I know that you folks at the Climate Mental Health Network have really been thinking a lot about this kind of stuff, how to support young people. And you recently released a toolkit designed to help equip them and adolescents who support them with the skills necessary to manage climate-related emotions and support positive mental health. Could you explain some of the key findings from this project?
Yeah. So to give you a little bit of context, we had been doing all this research and had done a review paper on the mental health impacts of climate change on youth, and we're just really concerned about what we were reading and seeing about all of the intense anxiety and grief that adolescents were experiencing. And so we wanted to do something about it, and we were interested in schools because we thought, well, schools are a place where you can get to a lot of young people at once and really diverse groups of young people. Um, and so we were focused on middle school in particular because that's the time point in which young people are often first given formal education on climate change. So it seemed like a potential meaningful point of intervention. So we started with a research study in 2023, and we wanted to know if emotions related to climate change were showing up in middle school classrooms, and if so, what did they look like? What were they due to direct impacts or indirect impacts of climate change? And what kind of resources teachers might need to better support their students in the context of climate change. So we did a survey and focus groups with 63 middle school teachers around the country. We really pulled from like diverse corners of the country. We had LA and New York, but we also had rural Alabama and Texas and, Minnesota, and, all different kinds of, populations. We focused on Title I public schools. And we found that the majority of teachers said their students had expressed negative emotional impacts related to either experiencing extreme weather events directly or to a growing awareness of the problem of climate change. So 76% of teachers said their students had been directly impacted by an extreme weather event. And 72% said their students had expressed worry directly, had expressed worry directly related to this weather event. And 71% of teachers said their students expressed worry when learning about climate change in the classroom. So there was definitely a need for the resources, it seemed, or for some resources and support. And to underscore that further, the majority of teachers said that they did not currently have the resources and support they needed to effectively support student climate emotions. We also found that teachers themselves were experiencing a lot of emotions about, climate change. A lot of them, had been directly impacted by extreme weather, or their school had been closed for, periods of time due to a hurricane or a flood. So they also had their own emotions that they were dealing with that were kind of trickling into the classroom in the way that they taught. And we also asked them, okay, well, if we're going to create resources, give us some input, tell us what you want, what would be the most effective. And that's where they told us about, one of the recommendations was this peer-to-peer messaging and a lot of other, insights and about what would be useful. They said, keep it short, keep it easy, align it with standards that are already out there. So based on what they said, we developed, along with our partners at the National Environmental Education Foundation, a toolkit that is the Climate Emotions Toolkit, and it includes a guide for teachers to help them understand and prepare for climate emotions that might arise in the classroom. And it also includes a set of hands-on classroom activities that we took care to align with social emotional learning and science standards that teachers can use to help them acknowledge and address climate emotions effectively in the classroom. So, when teachers are teaching about climate change, or they're talking about things happening in the news, or they're being, there's wildfire in the smoke in the, outside the classroom, that they have the tools and the resources they need to be able to talk about that and open up that conversation with their students, and to be able to be a source of support and resilience for their students. So after we developed the toolkit, we did a lot of testing, and we actually ran a pilot with 40 teachers from around the country who piloted the resources in their classrooms with middle school students. Thousands of students tried them. And we asked them for very honest feedback, and I was taken aback to find that 95% of teachers found the toolkit valuable, 97% said they'd use the activities again, and 100% said they would recommend the toolkit to a colleague. So we were gratified to find that, they needed the resources, and once we gave them to them based on their input, they really found them useful, and it seemed like it was something that they would, could benefit from. And one of the most heartening findings to me was really that teachers said that it really increased their connection to their students, like that they became closer to their students because of having these conversations about climate change and their emotions about climate change. Saying, I'm really nervous about climate change too, and, tell me about your feelings about it. Let's talk about it. Let's open up this conversation, that it made, the students feel less alone and more connected to their teachers. And I think that was the most important to me, because we know that connection and community are these foundational cornerstones of resilience.
Thanks, Larissa. I mean, I think those rates, 97% saying they would use it again and 100% saying they recommend it, means that you're just tapping into just this incredible need out there and desire for these kinds of tools and information, a way to process emotions in response to climate change. Merlot, I know you've done some thinking about this and then developed some tools that are useful for you, and you're sharing with some of your networks. Would you like to share with us some of the things that you've done?
Yeah, of course. And also, Ernie, could you please share the slide? Thank you. Larissa, I really enjoyed hearing about the Climate Action Toolkit. And yes, these tools definitely resonate with me. These skills can be very helpful, and something that we talked about in our podcast with the Youth Scientific Council on Adolescence, where we highlighted both mental and physical health, called the Mind-Body Loop. And that podcast should be coming out soon, so stay tuned. Additionally, I created Authentically Me after attending a conference alongside my mentor and Harvard professor, Dr. Harrison Cohen. Authentically Me is an initiative where you get together with others, put your phones in a basket, and connect with yourself and others around you while being your true, authentic self and talking about things that are going on in the world, and create art, which is something that we have really enjoyed doing, on things such as climate change. Furthermore, I've been very interested in dialectical behavioral therapy, and I just completed a paper on it where I learned a multitude of skills and created a visual of my favorite skills called the flower bundle. You need all the skills, not just one. These skills can be very helpful, especially as climate change can be a very heavy topic, or even helpful during this time after the fires. I want to talk a little bit more about this visual I created. Basically, in the top corner, it's a bunch of flowers, which is saying that you can't just have one skill, you have to have all of them. And a lot of the time when we get information about, for example, climate change, we may have vulnerabilities such as we didn't eat, we didn't take our medicine, we didn't sleep. There's so many aspects that can affect this, so we may not be as effective when we are going out and creating that action. Another thing is to build up an armor, it might be helpful to have like a pleasant event each day. Another thing is we can try paced breathing, which sometimes it can be really anxiety provoking when we hear that there's a disaster and we're not sure what to do. So it can be helpful to breathe or use ice to activate the vagus nerve, and it can help regulate your nervous system. Another thing is we get a lot of information that is put out about climate change. Some of it on social media can even be misinformation. So I think it's important to check the facts and also see how that impacts you emotionally and checking the facts on that. And lastly, there's problem solving, where we can use this both to help our emotions, but also to help us solve the problem in the world, which I feel like is very impactful. So these are some of the skills that have helped me and also the adolescents that I've shared this information with. These are not all of them, but these are just some, like a little like piece of what can be helpful.
Well, thanks for sharing your work with us. I think what you see here on the screen is just a reflection of how you've pulled together so many different sources of information about mental health, about change, about the power of community. You're really bringing it together. You are, as a scientist, and the other scientists on this call would really respond to, is you're really thinking in a interdisciplinary kind of way. You're putting together a lot of different kinds of things. It's very, very impressive. Sander, I think it seems like a couple of these things, and Ernie, you could probably pull down the slide. A couple of these things seem to be similar to what you're trying to do, like the flowers about the power of connection. You talked about leveraging peers to create action and to motivate folks. Could you talk a little bit more about whether or not issues of how they feel about climate action might come into play? Are there emotions that need to be dealt with in some of the programs that you're developing with the young people? And then how do you convert that into action? Could you maybe dig a little bit more deeply into that?
Yes, so super interesting to hear about your work on climate emotions and links to mental health, for example. And I so how we tend to tend to see climate emotions is that although they can be painful emotions such as anxiety or climate worry, for example, um, they are of course reasonable responses to real threat, and also so what we sometimes think, and or that's at least what we in our group thought, is that sometimes eco-anxiety can be so intense that it becomes paralyzing. So we tested this idea both cross-sectionally, so in one and the same moment, but also over time. So we asked the question if adolescents who experience high levels of climate anxiety, if they would be less inclined to act on climate change later on. And actually what we found was the opposite. So to the extent that adolescents experience higher levels of anxiety, they are actually more likely to act on climate change. So here it seemed to be the case that anxiety and other negative climate emotions were actually energizing and motivated adolescents to take action on climate change. So yeah, that was an interesting finding for us, and also yeah, rather unexpected. And yeah, so one question that I think would be really interesting for scientists and for others to address is the question of say whether acting on climate change also has other benefits, psychological and perhaps social benefits for adolescents. I think, Andrew, that would also be a question that you may be very interested in. And I don't think that this evidence is already there now. So I think that would be a very important step to take for researchers.
Thanks, Sander. Yeah, I do think there's a fair amount of work in a variety of different areas when adolescents feel like they're contributing to the community. There's a lot of beneficial effects. It triggers some of those reward processing systems, gives us the warm glow. But I think it also highlights that in other studies of action among young people, you can't fake it, can't pretend. If it's make work, we all understand it's make work, particularly during adolescence. It really has to be meaningful and impactful and authentic. And then collectively having the chance to process what it means to them, themselves as individuals and a group and their community. Those are sort of the elements that research suggests that are really important for creating these programs that will support young people. Larissa, did you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, thanks. I had a burning thought, which was that I mean, it's not specifically in adolescence, so you may be aware of this work, but Sarah Schwartz and Susan Clayton and their group did a study that's the only study that I know of that looked at this, but they looked at the impacts of action on mental health, on psychological functioning. They found that collective action, but not individual action, was a buffer for the negative psychological impacts of climate change on mental health, or of climate change. So, you know, it's one study, but I think it's an interesting and promising avenue for more work to understand the impacts of, you know, the other direction. We're looking at, you know, mental health and how it impacts climate action. Well, how does it feed back and also, you know, impact mental health? How does taking action impact mental health? And making the case for collective action being potentially more impactful and more protective.
Merlot, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the ideas we discussed and how we should be thinking about them moving forward. So given your experience, given the themes that have come up about the importance of collective action, supporting young people to connect so that they have an impact, making sure they're real and authentic. In your experience, what are the kinds of things that we as communities, as schools, as parents, what can we do to support young people as they try to engage in action in response to the climate situation?
I think it's really important that young people continue to get educated, not only through social media, which is sometimes teens' favorite way to get information, but also through the school system. I also realize that there could be a lot of misinformation. So we need to kind of pick out the information that will be impactful. And I think that schools can do that to help support us. I think that it's also important that we start as early as kindergarten to even create something as simple as a bingo game talking about climate change so we're informed from a very young age. This is important as the adolescent mind is constantly developing and changing, and it has a lot of plasticity. So creating that from a younger age is really, really important. And helping to do this action for climate change can positively impact mental health, and using the toolkit that you mentioned can help us engage in climate action, which is also important. And I also want to highlight that just because you don't see a fire right in front of your eyes does not mean that climate change as an issue has disappeared. And I think that parents can also support their children when they're trying to do a project, because I feel like having someone there to help you just to support you at least is super important. And also teachers can help integrate this kind of information in the classroom, or as I had the experience of doing an outdoor classroom, which is really interesting.
Thanks, Merlot. I also want to encourage the audience to post key questions that you may have for the group, and we can move to them as they start appearing in the chat. So please share. I can see that there's one asking, how can schools ensure that climate action is meaningful for their students? So this whole question of meaningfulness and why it's important, and maybe Sandra, you can get us started, because I do think this at some element, this is the heart of what you're trying to get at.
Yes, and so what we are often intuitively inclined to do when we educate young people about climate change is that we talk about the future catastrophes that will occur if we don't act now. And while that is factually true, and I do think it is important to provide youth with honest and accurate information, I don't think that this is the best way or the most effective way to help young people cope with climate change or help young people act on climate change. I think what is additionally needed is to provide a sense of agency and also of hope. And hope is not just a feel-good emotion. Hope can be a power source for coping, can be a power source for action. And I think it is meaningful in that so climate experts constantly tell us that there is actually good reason to be optimistic about climate change, in the sense that we know exactly what is needed to be done to mitigate climate change. Right? What is needed now is political will and economic reforms and economic incentives, behavioral reform. Which of course is very challenging, but we already know exactly what is needed to be done to halt climate change. So I think, yeah, one core aspect of meaningful climate education for young people is not just to focus on the catastrophes that may occur, but to also convey a sense of hope and agency for young people.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for sharing that. I think along those lines, just thinking locally in the LA context, it makes me think about how 50 years ago, the air in Los Angeles was horrendous. It's still not as good as it should be, but it's nothing way it was 40 to 50 years ago. And through a series of a lot of reforms, particularly for automobile, gasoline, and engines and so on, it is so much better today than it was in the past. And so as you point out, there are things that can be done. We know that how we can do things and how to change things, and that could provide an element of hope. Another question in the audience is, how can we encourage youth to learn more about climate change? So Merlot, maybe I'll turn to you, and Larissa, you can respond accordingly if you want. But Merlot, when you in all of your efforts, you know about this issue, you do a lot of work in it, as you sort of try to share it with folks you know and your friends or people you don't know your age, how do you encourage them to be thinking about it?
I think that a lot of the research that has been done may not be like accessible in the way that it's digestible to adolescents. There might be like a lot of complex words that may be difficult to understand. So maybe taking an article and going through it like word by word or sentence by sentence could be super helpful to create that kind of to take away that divide and make it more accessible. I also think that showing films in classes could be super helpful because people love to see videos. And also, I think maybe creating a podcast focused solely on climate change, or I'm honestly even inspired to create my own podcast on kind of the connection between mental health and climate change. I feel like that could be super interesting. So having students tune into some of the podcasts. And also, I think starting from a younger age, if I did not learn in 7th grade, I don't think I would be as involved. I think it's even before that, we should be able to kind of create that change, and also potentially even I would get involved with Green Teens after this. It's really, really interesting, all of the stuff that's going on. We just have to make it easier for adolescents to understand, because the younger they learn, the easier it is to continue that work.
Thanks, Merlo. It's super helpful. First of all, don't hand a research paper to someone, to anybody, particularly a young person, but then also thinking about the unique ways that young people might consume information these days and preparing it that way. I'd like to actually extend the question about how to encourage young people to learn about climate change, because many people around the world who are in, let's say, in communities or countries that have the resources to do something about it, how do we get them to learn about the rest of the world that are suffering the impacts of climate change right now, very presently, very significant kinds of ways? And so maybe I'll turn to you, Sander, a little bit, because of the position of the Netherlands in Europe, and also having a perspective of Europe and sort of closer to some other regions around the world there. To what extent is awareness and getting people to think globally, and how do you manage that in the context of creating action? It seems like an important part of the equation.
Yeah. And so what is interesting is that there's this widespread stereotype about adolescents, that that they are a bit subject to the tyranny of the now, or that perhaps they are relatively self-interested. But then when you consider that it is actually young people that are centrally involved in the climate movement, and also when you consider the findings that Larissa already shared, that so many young people are so concerned about climate change. Yeah, it actually seems that something else is going on, and that here, when it comes to climate change, and when it comes, for example, to the climate protests that we have seen over the past couple of years, that these young people are not necessarily standing up out of their own interests, but they're also standing up out of interest in people growing up in very different parts of the world, or even growing up in the interests of people who are not even born yet, right? Future generations. So that is very, very striking to me, that this concern about other people, and concern about social justice, right? It is also very much about social justice and global justice, and that concern is already there. Yeah, so I do think also, when it comes to classroom settings and how do we communicate and educate young people about climate change, it is important to not only provide examples from, say, within one's close environment, but also to highlight the catastrophes, the climate catastrophes that are already occurring right now. So, for example, in our climate education that we provide here in the Netherlands, we also provide examples of the fires that you have seen in LA, right? It's very far away, but it does impact the students that we work with.
Thanks, Sander. Larissa, do you have any thoughts on the question of the global perspective for young people, and how to support that thinking? And
Well, actually, can I speak to the previous about just kind of climate action in general? I think that, that was something we heard a lot from when we did the research study with teachers, that, a lot of them were saying, like, my kids all want to do something, and I really don't know what to tell them to do that's actually going to make a difference, because my town doesn't even recycle. Like, we don't even have recycling pickup, and, we don't, like, we can do a bake sale, but that's just more pressure on the parents to do something. These parents are already, like, really stressed out, and, it's a low income free lunch school, and or Title I school. And so, I think there is a really strong need to kind of spread the word about what are like meaningful, actually impactful things that people can do that are within reach. And Project Drawdown, I highly recommend. They have a library of climate solutions, and it's really like all of the existing solutions that are out there for climate change. And if you can rank them based on their impact. So if, globally people took this particular action, like reducing food waste or solar, wind turbines, what would that impact be on emissions globally? And literally the number one most impactful action is not some high technological solution, it's reducing food waste. So based on that, my daughter has a kid-led climate change group called Future Fighters. And they, I told them about that. They took that and ran with it, and they started a composting program in our neighborhood, where people in our neighborhood could come and compost. And they also started composting and kind of saving food waste from going into the trash, and like apples that weren't eaten at their school, getting them into the hands of people that could eat them, that type of thing. So to try to do things locally at their school and to do things that would actually like make a real impact, based on the latest science. So I think there are like actually really easy things that are super kid appropriate, that I think teachers and parents need to kind of know about more so they can support their students.
Thanks, Larissa. That's a perfect example of just providing the opportunity and having young people learn with it. Merlot, do you want to give us the last word? We're going to have to finish up. So do you have a quick final comment to add to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to say another thing that we can do in the classroom is starting off each class with like a current event, especially like with climate change, so we can learn more about what's going on. And it can also be globally, because sometimes we tend to focus on just the local things that happen. So I feel like that could be super helpful to do in English classes or history classes or environmental classes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Merlot. Unfortunately, we're out of time. As you can see, we could keep talking about this for a lot more time, and really appreciate the expertise of everyone on this panel. And we want to thank everyone in attendance of our webinar. What an incredible group we've had. Larissa, Sander, Merlot, this has really been an enlightening discussion, and we're grateful for you to spend the time with us. I want to remind everyone that a recording of this video will be available on the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent website and on YouTube in the coming weeks. And if you want to learn more about adolescent development, please check out our website at developingadolescent.org. Have a great rest of your Earth Day, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.